Hello and welcome to the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast. This is a series of comedy podcasts all about Scotland's history by me, Daniel Downey. I'm a professional comedian based in Edinburgh. I'm also a historian. I have a master's degree in Scottish history. And today's episode is about Scotland in the 1690s. This is a period of our history remembered as the ill years on account of the terrible famines and the desperate economic situation that the nation found itself in. The 1690s was arguably the worst time to have ever existed in Scotland. It was a period of Scottish history more depressing than the Bertie Vogt era. Harvest failures in the second half of the 1690s created the most severe mortality crisis faced in Scotland until the introduction of the deep-fried Mars bar. At the height of the famine, mortality rates in some parts of the country were running as high as 20%, which is about the same as your average ICE agent. Scotland's famines were exasperated by the impossible economic situation the nation found itself in because of the 9 Years' War. War against France had decimated Scottish trade with the French, and despite the fact that many Scots were fighting in the Williamite army against the French, King William continued to have a distaste for Scottish people and a disinterest in Scottish affairs. And this was despite the flamboyant, colourful parades that his supporters in Scotland liked to put on for him. The rampant mercantilism and economic nationalism of major European colonial empires left Scotland locked out by prohibitive trade tariffs, war, inflation, and protective tariffs. These were just a handful of the controversies and disasters witnessed during the ill years of 2024 to 2026. Now, obviously, the most obvious means of dealing with food shortage, inflation, and a cost of living crisis is, of course, to build a ballroom and or invade Iran. But the Scottish Government opted for a different approach. To try and keep pace with the economic powerhouses of Europe, the Scots floated a joint stock company named the Company of Scotland. The Company of Scotland was created to try and compete with the powerful mercantile English and Dutch East India companies. But despite receiving huge investment, the Company of Scotland would turn out to be a disaster, an overfunded national embarrassment, the live golf of the 17th century. Now, if this is the first time that you have listened to the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast, then this is the sort of thing that you should expect. It's mostly Scottish history with jokes about the royal family and Donald Trump. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, you've probably not made it this far anyway. Anyway, without further ado, here is your podcast all about the ill years of the late 1690s. I do hope you enjoy it, have fun out there, and I'll see you all on the other side. Enjoy! Scotland in the 1690s moved from a period of military and political crisis to a period of devastating famines, remembered as the ill years. In 1695, 1696, and most devastatingly of all, in 1698 and 1699, harvests in Scotland and across Northern Europe failed, and the results were devastating. There wasn't enough grain to feed people or livestock, and with no cattle to pull ploughs and people too emaciated to carry out daily tasks, crops failed and starvation set in. An account in 1696 from the Scottish physician and geographer Sir Robert Sibbald stated, "Everyone can see death in the face of the poor that abound everywhere." Aberdeen, the Highlands and the Northern and Western Isles were the hardest hit parts of the country, with mortality rates in these areas running as high as 20%. People were dying of hunger, and the epidemics that followed finished off many more. Out-migration caused by the worsening situation saw a 13% demographic decline in Scotland. This, coupled with a roughly 5% mortality rate across the population on the whole, positions the Scottish famines of the 1690s alongside the more well-known Great Famine of 1840s Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland in terms of its severity. Yet despite this, Brewers Fayre still somehow managed to hold on. No one really knows how they do it. The 1690s is pretty much universally accepted as one of the worst times to be alive in Scotland. Despite this fact, Rangers fans, they still love to sing about how great it was. But then again, their supporters do love to sing about famines. The first reports of crop failure in Scotland appear in 1696, and during these first 2 years of failed harvest in Scotland in 1695 and 1696, the nation was able to fend off the very worst conditions thanks to harvests from the north of the country, which were not as badly affected, the people there being well versed in how to survive in unlivable conditions. It was the final years of famine that were the most devastating. A brief respite in 1697 could not provide enough food to sustain the following bad years of harvest, which would affect the entirety of the nation. People were dying in front of each other's eyes on the streets of towns and villages across the country and in Scotland's rural communities. Mass burials were reported in all areas of Scotland. The famine was so severe that people didn't even have enough money for one of Lee Anderson's 50p meals. In 1696, there were food riots in Dundee, Montrose and St Andrews. In St Andrews, crowds broke up homes searching for concealed grain. In Leith, in the spring of 1699, female wool spinners rioted to try and prevent the export of food and wool amid spiralling grain prices. Starvation and rising food prices resulted in a surge of outmigration. In the second half of the 1690s, as many as 50,000 Scots emigrated, mostly to Ireland and mainland Europe. Scotland had known famine in the 17th century. It had, however, been half a century since such prolonged famine and food shortages had been experienced in the country. The famines of the 1690s would be the last general famine experienced in Scotland. That is a famine that affected the entirety of the nation. There were periods of shortage throughout the 18th century and the failure of the potato crop in the 19th century that created a devastating famine in Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland. But the effects of the 1846 potato crop failure, as devastating as they were, created famine conditions in Scotland that were restricted purely to the Highlands. The famines of the 1690s were the last time a famine gripped the entirety of the nation, and it remains the worst famine in recorded Scottish history. The famines took the population by surprise. Harvesting and farming techniques had developed throughout the 17th century to such a degree that most people thought crop failure had become impossible. Farming in late 17th century Scotland was more skilled than at any point in the nation's history. More land was under the plough, cattle stocks were higher, and food was being produced and moved efficiently via ship and Scotland's 2 paved roads connecting the Forth and Clyde estuaries and the capital with the southwest. Improving agricultural technology meant grain prices were stable and food shortages were rare. As far as most people were concerned, famine should not have been possible in 1690s Scotland. You think you've survived the bad times, things are finally starting to get better, and then suddenly everything becomes worse than you could ever imagine. It's like Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister. In the religious fervour of 17th century society, there was only one plausible explanation for Scotland's sustained period of famine, and that was God's retribution. In such a major crisis of subsistence and disease as the people of 1690s Scotland were suffering, it is perhaps not surprising that those reared with such a providential view of society, as was the case in most parts of lowland Scotland at the end of the 17th century, they interpreted the famine conditions as a sign of God's judgment. God was punishing Scotland. Now, by this point, he'd already given us the shitest weather on the planet, midges, and the English as our neighbours, but he wasn't done with us just yet. With this in mind, the famine became known as the 7 ill years of King William's reign. This was a biblical reference in Genesis, whereby Egypt is plagued with 7 years of divine-sent famine. In reality, Scotland's 7 ill years were actually only 4 years, but it speaks to the impression the famine had on contemporary Scots and King William standing amongst them that the name stuck. For contemporaries of 1690 Scotland, the age was indeed biblical and apocalyptic. There was a perception amongst many in Scotland at this time that the nation was in the throes of an almighty moral crisis, and that the famine had been caused by individuals who by their actions and beliefs dared to be different either politically or ecclesiastically. For hardline Presbyterians, it was the usual suspects: Episcopalians, Catholics, and supporters of the Stuart dynasty. If you supported who the authorities deemed to be the wrong side, you could be publicly executed and then posthumously accused of being a domestic terrorist by 17th century ICE agents roving the streets of the most dissenting areas of Scotland. The underlying paranoia of the infiltration of the Church of Rome into Scottish society reared its head again in the 1690s. But this does not mean that the most fervent of protesting Presbyterians were supporters of King William. The Williamite Revolution had, in Covenanting eyes, come with an abandoning of Covenanting principles in Scotland in favour of English religious values. God, he was now punishing his chosen people for breaking their covenant with him. To fend off starvation, Scotland had to cleanse itself of its sins, purge the ungodly, and become a covenanted kingdom once again. We need to let the religious extremists back into power to make Scotland great again. Because, it had worked out so well the first time around. There is no surer indicator of the increase of religious fervour associated with the famine than the revival of witch hunting that accompanied it. The distress and religious paranoia of 1690 Scotland manifested itself in a revival in witch hunting. With fewer migrants to blame for all of our problems, we had to turn to the next best thing: vulnerable women. Witch trials in Scotland had, by the 1690s, all but been eliminated. Scotland's lawyers and advocates were increasingly sceptical, and prosecutions had been made nigh on impossible after the publication of Sir John Dalrymple's Institutions of the Law of Scotland in 1681, the foundation of modern Scottish law. But it is no surprise that the last major witch hunt in the English-speaking world occurred in Scotland at the peak of the worst famine ever experienced in the nation's history. In Renfrewshire, between 1697 and 1700, witch hunts were instigated that resulted in 50 people being indicted and 6 strangled and burned at the stake as witches by Unite the Kingdom witch hunters. The actual cause of the harvest failures was climactic. The 1690s were decidedly colder than previous decades, and this had a devastating impact on the crop yields of Northern Europe. A change of climate had devastating consequences that created the greatest humanitarian crisis ever seen in Scotland. But there's no need to worry about that sort of thing nowadays. In Scotland, those farming upland areas away from the coast, where most of the nation's cultivation occurred in the 17th century, suffered the worst of the famine conditions. As shortages increased, so did the cost of staple commodities, spiralling beyond the reach of most of the labouring classes. There was no seed to sow. Stephen Bartlett was raging about it, and mills lay idle, which meant tenants who worked the land were unable to produce foodstuffs that they could sell at market and were unable to then pay their rents. And the effects were not restricted to Scotland's crop yields. The cold temperatures resulted in Arctic ice fields drifting further south. Eskimos in kayaks are reported to have made their way to Scotland in 1698. But do not worry, they were instructed to go straight back to where they came from on their small boats. The lowering sea temperature meant fish migrated further south, devastating Scottish fishing stocks, particularly in the Northern Isles. In Shetland, fishing catches dropped off so severely that trade between Shetland and European ports ceased entirely for 4 years between 1696 and 1700. Disease amongst livestock and then a smallpox outbreak on the island resulted in parts of Shetland losing up to 2/3 of its population through disease and starvation in the second half of the 1690s. In 1696, the Privy Council opened ports in the west of Scotland to the import of Irish foodstuffs. The country had now reached rock bottom as it was reduced to drinking Irish whiskey. The opening of Scotland's ports to imports of externally produced grain was an unprecedented step for a 17th century Scottish government. Standard practice for most 17th century European governments was to seize and destroy foreign foodstuff. Protectionism was standard. Imports were restricted and prevented from entering the domestic market to protect native producers. Outside food wasn't allowed in. It's like when you go to the cinema or the Gaza Strip. In 1696, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Scotland's landowners were losing large amounts through a lack of grain and livestock sales and unpaid rents from their tenants. But despite the desperate economic conditions, there were estate owners in Scotland and tenants on large farms who were able to escape the worst of the conditions, both physically and economically. Large estate owners near the coast were able to profit from the hugely inflated grain price. Landowners, for example, who owned 17th century airports profited from the extremely inflated food prices. Some landowners were able to charge £14 for a microwave chili con carne, and one landowner in particular, one W.H. Smith, made an absolute fortune. But for most landowners, they were left with little choice but to import grain and purchase seed to supply their tenants with. Responsibility for the poor did not fall upon the government. Assistance for the poor was the domain of Martin Lewis and the local Kirk Sessions and General Assembly. In 1696, 1698 and 1699, the General Assembly called for a fast to deal with food shortages, but this was just a meagre attempt at trying to ration what little food there already was. Less bread was being eaten in 1690 Scotland than in 21st century Los Angeles. And with Scotland being a Protestant country, the church couldn't even hand out wafers and wine. Hungry people required the assistance of Kirk Sessions, but there was nothing like enough relief in the local parishes. The Poor Law only offered assistance to the infirm, and so most people were reduced to begging. Begging was rife throughout the ill years in Scotland. At the height of the famine, an estimated 1 in 6 people were forced to beg for food, around 200,000 people in total. With such desperate conditions, it is perhaps surprising that food riots were not more common, but it's difficult to over-accentuate just how powerful landowners were in 17th century Scotland. A Scottish barony or small estate had tenants under closer authority than Britney Spears' dad. Scottish landowners wielded more power over their tenants than almost any other comparable country in 17th century Europe. Most tenancies could be broken at short notice. If, for example, the developer wanted to build student flats, then the tenant, they would be removed immediately. And when a tenant was removed, they would find it almost impossible to find another pitch without a reference of good behaviour from the Kirk Session. Also, Baron courts were still in operation in Scotland at this time. This gave the landowner the power to personally try criminal offences that occurred on their land. And so power and freedom were firmly in the hands of the landowners, and the social discipline of the Kirk fell upon everyone. If a tenant caused trouble, they could be easily removed and or prosecuted. This, coupled with the fact that most people were emaciated, starving and close to death, meant that there was very little that they could do about their situation throughout the ill years of the 1690s. The picture painted of 17th century Scotland in this podcast has been one of a religious extremist near feudalistic society now devastated in the 1690s by an almighty famine. And as much as this was the case in many respects, it doesn't tell the full story. In reality, the barrage of social and economic disasters of the ill years was a blip in an economy that was in steady transition towards more coherent organisation and greater productivity. As mentioned previously, significant agricultural and land management improvements had been achieved in Scotland in the 17th century. At the beginning of the 1690s, all areas of Scotland were progressing economically. In less than 50 years, Glasgow had doubled in size, becoming the nation's most important trading port, trading with Western England, Ireland and North America. Small ports in Fife, they were shipping coal to Europe. Linen had become a huge industry for rural spinners, and vast numbers of cattle were driven into England every autumn. And Scotland's capital, Edinburgh, it had developed into an attractive, modern, European city able to justify £8 for a pint. The ecclesiastical dominance of previous generations was also beginning to wane, with higher standards of critical and creative thought emerging in Scotland. And some of this intellectual development of the period was making its way to the labouring classes as well, although the higher standards of critical and creative thought would suffer a severe blow with the introduction of GB News. But in 1696, the Scottish Parliament passed the Act for the Setting of Schools, and this act is a substantial achievement of Scottish history. The act demanded that every parish in Scotland must provide a school and a schoolmaster that was paid for by the landowner. All children, boys and girls, were permitted to attend the parish schools regardless of their social standing, although for girls, there were fewer opportunities. Girls attended for fewer hours and often only when available places were not being taken up by boys. And there were other issues as well. The sheer size of parishes meant that many children had to travel vast distances to attend school, and many simply didn't as a result. The Act demanded that all parishes in Scotland provide a school, but in reality there were, until the late 18th century, very few parish schools outside of the lowlands. And the schools were not free. Although inexpensive compared to the schooling of the upper classes, school fees were usually beyond that of the average agricultural labourer. But nonetheless, this system of education made social mobility just about possible in Scotland, although Murrayfield Stadium remained the strict domain of the privately educated. If a boy from a parish school had a particularly conscientious and able teacher, they could make it from the parish school to one of Scotland's universities, and, most remarkable of all, some Scottish students from working class backgrounds were actually enrolled into the University of Edinburgh, something that would be considered unthinkable in contemporary Scotland. The parish schools provided education for a wider cross-section of society than any other European nation at the time. By the middle of the 18th century, adult literacy rates in Scotland were around 75%, a number far greater than in England and most other European countries. Unlike countries such as Trump's 21st century America, 17th century Scotland actually valued and strived for an educated population. Despite these economic and societal advances, Scotland was, at the end of the 17th century, still a very poor country comparable to large European nations with colonial empires. In the 1690s, Scotland was in a desperate economic condition and gripped by the worst period of famine in its recorded history. Although inextricably linked, famine was not the only cause of Scotland's economic problems in the 1690s. The Williamite Revolution had brought with it war on the continent. In May 1689, England declared war on France. It was a war supposedly in defence of Protestantism, but was ultimately a war fought to secure the legitimacy of William and Mary's thrones. The war between England and France, fought between 1689 and 1697, renewed again in 1702, brought significant economic consequences for Scotland. Just as the Anglo-Dutch wars of the 1650s, 1660s and 1670s had decimated trade with Scotland's strongest trading partner, the Dutch, the Anglo-French wars of the 1690s crippled Scotland's trade with France. Scotland had once again lost one of its most important trading partners at the behest of the English, who have been making European trade needlessly difficult for Scotland since the 17th century. The 9 Years' War created a disastrous situation for Scottish merchants who were restricted from trading with the French and the English. Despite Scottish involvement in the wars against the French, England did not offer Scotland any trade privileges with her colonies. The English navigation laws created protective tariffs that prevented foreign nations from direct trade with English colonies, and Scotland was considered foreign. The Scottish Governor of East New Jersey, Andrew Hamilton, was removed from his position in 1697 as it was deemed illegal to have a Scottish national holding the position of Governor of an English colony. And then in 1696, the English further tightened their navigation laws, making trade even more prohibitive and leaving Scotland in a position whereby it was unable to trade with the enemy it was fighting or the colonies of her ally. Scottish merchant ships were being seized not only by the French, but also by English vessels who suspected them of illicit trade with the French. In 1696, one of Scotland's 3 warships, the Royal William, was fired at by the Royal Navy ship HMS Norwich for not wearing a poppy, and for not dipping its flag in deference to the English vessel. The English were being complete dicks and making European trade more difficult for Scotland. And just like in contemporary Scotland, the only people who actually supported this nonsense were those who love King William. Scottish Anglo tensions were running high, or rather higher than usual, and King William, he was an ineffectual and tactless ruler, incapable of dousing hostilities. William was no diplomat. He cared little about Scottish affairs or Scottish politics. Scottish ministers in London consistently tried to convince William to visit his northern kingdom, but their requests fell on deaf ears. And disinterest in Scottish affairs would remain the governmental position in Westminster until North Sea oil was discovered in the 1980s. When it came to his respective kingdoms, William's allegiance and attention was always with England. In 1694, Queen Mary died at the age of 32, and she had always been the more affable of the two. Mary had done a lot to compensate for her husband's social inadequacies, and it was Mary's claim that had brought William the British crowns. But now that he was king in his own right, his already marginal interest in Scotland faded further still. William's wife was far more popular than him and did a lot to make him look like less of a dick. She was playing the Princess Diana role. Scottish losses were significant in the 9 Years' War that was not going well for William. The Williamite government imposed poll taxes in Scotland to try and raise enough money to maintain the sizable standing army required to keep bringing the fight to the French on the continent. And raising tax in a country gripped by famine and still smarting from the scandal of Glencoe was making King William deeply unpopular in Scotland. There was very real concern amongst Scottish Whigs that the 7 ill years of King William's reign would culminate in his northern kingdom being lost to the Jacobites. Mercantilism was the dominant economic system of 17th century Europe. And mercantilism is a protective economic position whereby nations use protectionist tariffs to minimise imports and maximise exports from their expanding colonial empires. It's a bellicose system designed to lock out rival nations by putting tariffs on places such as the Trump-hating Heard and McDonald Islands, populated by those freeloading penguins. This period of rampant mercantilism and economic nationalism seen in Europe at the turn of the 18th century badly damaged Scottish interests. Both English and French industries were protected by duties, and Scotland was locked out from both. Across Europe, tariffs were being raised in virtually all of Scotland's key markets. By the beginning of the 18th century, there was no trading partner of any significance with whom Scotland had a surplus. In this economic climate, England became Scotland's main trading partner, and this was a situation that the Scots were desperate to get out from, because an over-reliance on the English market would mean that Scotland would be left increasingly vulnerable to decisions being made in England. Scotland, despite the technological and societal advancements mentioned earlier in the podcast, was, at the turn of the 18th century, a desperately poor and insignificant European nation comparable to England, France, the Netherlands and Spain. And so, to try and tackle the economic problems it was facing and join the mercantile big leagues, Scotland would make a bid for a foothold in the New World in the 1690s to try and take a share in this golden treasure of colonial trade. Key to the emergence of a mercantile economic system was the formation of joint stock companies. Joint stock companies allow for leading merchants and landowners to partner and raise vast amounts of capital to invest in New World colonisation. Everybody pays into something in the expectation that they will then receive something back from their investment later down the line. The modern day equivalent is a public limited company, a PLC. Or an OnlyFans account, I suppose. At the turn of the 18th century, by far and away the most dominant of these joint stock companies were the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. In Scotland, steps were being taken in the 1690s to try and create a joint stock company that could rival the successes of the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. We were investing millions in a desperate attempt to try and keep up with our more powerful neighbours. It's the same reason why we still have rusting nuclear weapons from the 1950s in Britain. Sorry, my mistake. Those nuclear weapons are very much solely only in Scotland. In July 1695, Scotland's first commercial bank was established, the Bank of Scotland. The bank was given a monopoly on joint stock banking in Scotland for 21 years and was the first bank to print its own banknotes, although these notes were rarely accepted outside of Scotland. Some things never change in that respect. It's a little known fact that all children born in this country's first words are, "That's legal tender, pal." Not many people know that about Scotland. The Bank of Scotland was established by means of an Act of Parliament, the 1693 Act of Parliament passed to encourage overseas trade. The Act for Encouraging Foreign Trade stated in it that the importance of trade concerns the wealth and welfare of the kingdom, and nothing has been found more effectual for the improving and enlarging thereof than the erecting and encouraging of companies whereby the same may be carried on by undertakings to the remote parts, which is not possible for single persons to undergo. This excerpt from the 1693 Act of Parliament laying out the reasons why one must travel to remote parts was actually quoted by Andrew Windsor to Emily Matlas to explain why he travelled to Epstein Island. And also Pizza Express. In June 1695, another act was passed by the Scottish Parliament, the Act for a Company Trading to Africa and the Indies. This act established a new government-backed and royally approved joint stock company in Scotland, the Company of Scotland. The Act gave the company substantial trading privileges. The Company of Scotland was given a 31-year monopoly on any new trade posts established in Asia, Africa and the Indies, and an exemption from paying customs, taxes and other duties for 21 years. These incredibly generous trading privileges and tax exemptions were unmatched until 2025 and the Trump administration's treatment of billionaires. The Act demanded that at least half of the £600,000 capital deemed necessary to float the company be raised in Scotland and a 50% Scottish ownership be maintained. But the Company of Scotland was, from its inception, intended to be a joint Scottish-Anglo venture, an attractive investment prospect for English merchants looking to challenge the dominance of the English East India Company and capitalise on the generous trading concessions being offered. The generous trading privileges afforded to the company turned out to be detrimental to its success. When the Act became public, it caused consternation amongst potential investors who feared, correctly, that the powerful English joint stock lobby would intervene to curtail English investment in the Scottish company. Well-established joint stock companies such as the English East India Company and the Royal Africa Company were outraged that a newly established company should be given such remarkable trading privileges. They were vociferous in their opposition to the Company of Scotland and demanded that English investment be removed immediately. It was the position of the English East India Company that a pound spent in Croydon from a strict totalitarian calculus point of view was far more beneficial to Scotland than a pound spent in Strathclyde. In December 1696, the English East India Company appointed a committee that presented to the House of Lords a list of reasons why the Scotch Act would damage English trade. Scotland simply shouldn't be allowed to have a joint stock company or another independence referendum. The cacophony of growing protest led to the impeachment of the directors of the Company of Scotland, who were summoned to the House of Commons to answer the concerns raised by the English East India Committee. And what angered the English most was King William's approval of the Act. The Act had guaranteed protection from the King should any of the Company of Scotland's ships, goods, merchandise, persons or other effects be stopped, detained or stolen. In such a situation, King William promised to intervene and interpose his authority to have restitution, reparation and satisfaction made for the damage done. A promise that the King would not live up to. William's handling of the situation is yet more proof of just how disinterested and misinformed he was with regards to affairs in Scotland. An act of serious significance had been passed in Scotland, ratified by the King, with trade implications for both Scotland and England, and William clearly was unaware of its contents and or implications. The mere mention of Scottish affairs at this time is reported to have sent William into a debilitating rage. This Company of Scotland debacle was, from William's perspective, an annoying distraction from his war on the continent. And so the Scots, they were not going to get any support from King William. As soon as pressure was applied from the English joint stock lobby, King William immediately submitted to their will, quipping famously, "I have been ill served in Scotland." To the English, King William promised to prevent the inconveniences of this act, and legislation was drawn up that made English subscriptions into the Company of Scotland illegal. The English government made it illegal to invest in Scotland. It's why HS2 stops in Birmingham. English joint stock companies were given trade concessions equal to the Company of Scotland. Scots were banned from seeking the assistance of English seamen, shipbuilders and insurance companies, and there was a tightening of the English navigation laws, making Scots trade with English colonies even more prohibitive than it had been previously. Of the £600,000 raised to float the Company of Scotland, £300,000 had come from England, which meant that half of the total investment was now lost. From the Scottish perspective, the impeachment of the company's directors and the weaponising of the Westminster government against the Company of Scotland were an attack on Scottish sovereignty. Keeping the company afloat with solely Scottish investment would become a national endeavour. Angry, determined, and unperturbed by the English prohibitions, subscriptions into the Company of Scotland continued to pour in from across Scotland in a fervour of patriotic enthusiasm. It's estimated that as many as 200,000 Scots, 1 in 5 of the nation's people, were represented in the funding of the Company of Scotland. This was a truly national project, with subscriptions coming in from every corner of the nation and across societal classes. And a similar funding effort is going to be required of Scots when reform get into Westminster and we have to club together to keep our own fucking parliament open. Motivation for investing in the Company of Scotland was, first and foremost, a hopeful return on investment. But there was also something more powerful at play, a desire for national enrichment and economic independence. Now, this would all have made for a brilliant get it right up you had the thing actually been successful. But unfortunately, the project would turn out to be a complete and utter disaster. And the only thing that the Scots would prove to the English was that when it comes to big national projects, Scotland can fuck it up far more spectacularly than Westminster ever could. The story of the Company of Scotland is not one of stirring national success. It's one of unmitigated disaster. The company would, under the stewardship of the London-based Scottish merchant William Paterson, focus its attention on the establishment of a single colony on the Darien Isthmus in modern-day Panama. Scotland hoped to send pasty white ginger people to settle a colony in Panama. And you can probably guess how well the whole thing panned out. The disastrous Darien scheme would mark the beginnings of the end of Scotland's economic and political independence, and it would go down in history as the nation's greatest ever folly. And it is the Darien scheme that we are going to talk about on the next few episodes of the podcast. So that brings us to the end of the podcast, folks. I do hope that you enjoyed this episode. It's definitely an under-researched period of Scottish history, this. You're not going to find a lot about the famines of the 1690s and your kind of general history books on Scotland. So I don't think if I hadn't gone away and got a master's degree in Scottish history that I would have had the research skills necessary to do a full episode on it. So I think it's a period of our history that definitely needs illuminated, because this really was a truly awful time in our history. But I hope that you enjoyed the episode and you found it interesting and enlightening. If you are enjoying the series, then please rate the podcast, like it, share it, help me grow my audience. If you appreciate the effort that goes into me researching, recording and producing these episodes, you can give me the price of a cup of coffee or a pint of beer at my Patreon, Ko-fi or Buy Me a Coffee accounts. I'm on all of those at Mountebank Scotland. It's all massively, massively appreciated. Give me a wee follow on social media. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Mountebank Scotland. I'm usually on there doing little clips about Scottish history and stand-up comedy clips and stuff like that. And those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast will know that at the end of each episode, I match what I'm talking about in the podcast with a malt whiskey from Scotland. And I'm going to match the events of the ill years with Springbank. Springbank, if you know whiskey, you don't need me to tell you about it. It's like the unicorn of Scottish whiskey. I mean, it really is spectacular. It's a Campbellton whiskey, and it's incredibly rare, which is why I'm matching it with the ill years. Food was incredibly scarce during this period of famine, and Springbank is always scarce, basically. I visited the distillery last year, and even in Campbellton, when you go to the distillery, they put one bottle of 15-year-old Springbank out on the shelf every day. They only sell one bottle of 15-year-old in the actual distillery every day. That's how scarce it is. And it's because it's all independent. They do all their own maltings there. It's a brilliant place to visit if you ever come and visit Scotland. And the whiskey is absolutely spectacular. If you're in a pub and you see a bottle of Springbank behind the bar, it doesn't matter what the age statement is on it, buy a dram of it. It's absolutely spectacular. I think that's everything. I do hope that you're enjoying the series. I really appreciate your support. And I'll see you all next time around. Cheerio then. Bye-bye.